Hello and welcome. Yeah, we are picking up on yesterday's topic a little bit and carrying it forward because there's another point I wanted to make that goes kind of hand in hand with distribution. So I talked a lot yesterday about how comic books used to be available in more places. They were on newsstands. If you're young, probably don't know what a newsstand actually is unless you've been to an airport and you've seen like the random airport bookstore and the wall of magazines in it. That's a newsstand. I mean, that's kind of like the modern interpretation of one. But a newsstand is a place where you used to be able to go and purchase periodicals. You'd have newspapers, magazines, there'd be trade paperback books, that kind of material available. Also, usually like gum and maybe some chips or a drink or something. You used to be able to get that kind of stuff there. It was called a newsstand. It was called that because their principal product that they sold were newspapers. Wow. Talk about a blast from the past, right? This is a really cool page, isn't it? Like, I just saw this on Matt Trent's post, and I was like, yeah, we're going to use that as a thumbnail. So here we are using that as a thumbnail, completely without merit, because we ain't going to be talking about this. This ties back into yesterday's topic of distribution. So when I was a kid, comic books cost pocket change. Literal pocket change. Just a couple coins. Like 3 quarters, maybe 4 quarters. And you could get that. Like, even if you were poor, scrounging up a buck wasn't hard. I should know. I was dirt poor, and I could always scrounge up like a buck. Well, that's not the case anymore. Mainstream comic books have decided, or I should say, did decide. Let's be assertive. They did decide in the late 80s, early 90s to jack up their prices. Now, there are probably good business reasons for this, like the cost of ink and paper and whatever went up. But at that point, comic books were selling single issues to the order of hundreds of thousands of books. You had volumes of scale on your side. So, as an example, I saw this tweet earlier today. I've had this comic book since I was a kid. It's bagged up right now. It's a great issue of Spectacular Spider-Man. Really, really like to take advantage of some of the gangster characters that are in Spider-Man's Rogues Gallery, and it treats them well. It makes them feel very threatening. It's an exciting, thrilling issue. Price $1. Year, he says this is from 1989, so I believe him that it's from 1989. All I remember is this is from like when I was like 8 or 9 or something. Little kid. I had this. So exact year, not sure for myself, but he says 89. Okay? Let's flash forward just a couple of years to one of the Spider-Man, like one of the earliest cross comic events that I remember. There was before, like, yeah, I think 1991 was Infinity Gauntlet, and then I remember Maximum Carnage being like 2 years later. Okay? So Amazon.com will apparently sell me a digital copy of Spider-Man Unlimited #1, which is the start of the Maximum Carnage plotline. Do you see the price on the cover? $3.95. This is just 4 years later. How do you go from $1 to $4 in the span of 4 years? It's insane. I remember, I lived this. I went through this. So up until 91 or so, comic books were like a buck, maybe a buck and a quarter. It wasn't that much. You could scrounge that up. And then I remember going to the gas station one time and seeing an X-Men comic and going, oh, that looks pretty cool. It was all about Sabretooth. This would have been 1994, I think. And the book was like $3. And I had to pause. I was like, man, $3, but it's about Sabretooth and stuff. This looks really cool. And I get it home and it turned out to be a really crappy issue and it sucked, which is why it sticks in my memory. But the book cost $3. 3 times the price in the span of just a couple of years. When this happens in like a whole country, you call that hyperinflation. When it happens to the comic book industry, it's apparently normal. And so from that period, I kind of stopped buying comic books like 1994 or something. I was poor. I didn't have that kind of disposable money to go drop $5 on the comic book when I could save up for like 2 months and buy a video game instead. And I knew I was going to enjoy the video game a lot more, especially after some disappointing comic books came my way. So that's kind of the world that happened. That's kind of the transition. Comic books went from being this cheap, disposable product that you would just read and abuse. Like I have comic books I've had since I was a kid. I got Captain Power issue number 1. The staples have pulled completely free of the spine. It's a fun comic. I read it to pieces. But the floppy, and let's flip over here to my dimly lit webcam. But the floppy comic, at some point, and that point was when the boomers grew up, was decided to be the premium product instead of the disposable product. It's a floppy. There's nothing here to protect these pages from getting crinked, bent, torn, anything like that. This should be disposable. Instead, this is treated like it's a premium item. This is treated like it's special somehow. Whereas when you get trade paperbacks, and I realize this is a graphic novel, not a trade paperback, but it's the only one I had handy. These are not treated like the premium product. These are treated somehow, despite being on better paper, despite having good cover stock, despite being square bound, despite being a real book. This is treated as the inferior product. It doesn't make any sense. But because when the boomers grew up, they were upset because their parents, their mom had threw away Spider-Man, Amazing Fantasy number whatever he was in, or they threw away their Superman number 1 that they got from their uncle, that kind of stuff. I said Superman number 1. I meant Action Comics number 1. Their parents threw that stuff away, and now suddenly those things, because there were so few of them intact, skyrocketed in price. And because of that, all the trash paper, I'm calling comic books out, I'm calling them out. That's what a comic book is. It's trash paper. All that stuff became the premium product. That's why I'm sitting over here with like 800 bags and boards to put comic books into. It's ludicrous. These are supposed to be cheap and disposable, but the price went from being cheap, $1, to $4, which is what a modern comic book costs in just 4 years. It's absolutely ludicrous. Comic books stopped being something that was easy to pick up off the rack and purchase and take home. And after these price hikes in the early 90s, after comic books went from being $1 to $2, $3, $4 in the span of just a few years, I think $3 was more common than $4. This is kind of an outlier. I'm going to freely admit that. But comic books did that, and it really tanked their ability to be sold on newsstands. It's no wonder that after the Heroes World fiasco and all that stuff, all the big publishers kind of just let their newsstand ambitions die and took refuge. They took shelter inside of the direct market with its very small number of distributors who it was much easier to work with. Because the newsstand market, absolutely wild. But after the Heroes World debacle, there was like 2 whole distributors handling comic books to comic book stores. And I think Diamond bought the other one. Like, that's just how it went. Much easier to only deal with 1 vendor than 10. Much easier to maintain relationships. It's much easier to deal with 1 set of policies than several. But they stuck themselves into a small box and they abandoned much of the outside world. The last time, when I was younger, the last time I bought a superhero comic, or just a comic book, let me just phrase it that way. Last time I bought a comic book from outside of a comic book store was when I bought the Fantastic Four relaunch in from 1996 or something like that. Like that number 1. And then I didn't see a comic book in the wild outside of a comic book store or like a flea market thing selling old issues. I didn't see a comic book for years until I went to like Barnes and Noble looking for Alterna comics that were supposed to be on the newsstand, and I would find an issue now and then, and I pop in like once a month and find like 1 issue, and that was in like 2018. That's what the price change did. It helped drive comic books off of the newsstand, out of the general availability to the public, and sent them scurrying to a small box where only people who were in the know, the chosen clerisy, they were the only ones who knew where these things were, who knew how to get them, who could navigate the stupid pull list system. That is the dumbest thing. Just sell me a subscription, DC. Just sell me a subscription, Marvel. Like, just let me send you like $50 and you send me 12 comics in a year. Like, what happened to that? I don't know. I guess shipping's too much now. It doesn't make sense. But shipping was a lot back then, too. Oh, wait. It's because you have to treat these things like premium products and you can't just throw them in like a manila envelope anymore. You actually have to put it in a Gemini mailer and ship it because when the person gets it and it's dinged, they're going to complain because they treat the stupid, fragile, floppy piece of paper as a premium product instead of being the disposable junk it's meant to be. And that has to do with the stupid price hike. That has to do with Image Comics in the early 90s rolling in and costing more than everybody else. Just lots of factors like that. Prices go up, availability drops, people don't want the stuff because they can't afford the stuff because it ain't as cheap. Stuff gets driven out of places where it was more readily accessible, becomes stuck in a tiny box. And this was the moment. The early 90s. That's what did it to comic books. You can look at some of the bad decisions made by Marvel, like they bought two separate trading card manufacturers for literally no reason. They bought a comic book store that had a distribution wing and immediately failed at running it and caused an industry-wide collapse and went into bankruptcy. Like, there's a lot of stuff that's crazy, but I will contend that the genesis of it had to do with, in the early 90s, prices rose way out of sync over the span of just a couple of years. Because after the prices rose to like $3, they kind of stayed that way off and on, at least for mainstream titles, until like 2015. Like, I could still buy DC books for $2.99 in 2018. Like The Flash would be $2.99. So if you want to know where comics went wrong, it was that weird collector's gouging stuff that they started doing in the early 90s. I'm not talking strictly like the gimmicks, although gimmicks play into this. I'm just talking the price hike. Kids could not afford $3.95. I know, I was there. I don't have this book. I've never read this book. I've never read the beginning of Maximum Carnage. I got a couple other issues that tie into Maximum Carnage, and those books are cheaper. But this one, wowzer. $3.95. That's insane. All right. Thank you so much for joining me. I don't know if I'm going to revisit this topic again anytime soon, but I just kind of wanted to get this like price hike stuff recorded because I feel like people kind of forgot that this happened. That comic books just went out of their way to traumatize people with the price hike in the early 90s. It's nuts. It's absolutely nuts. Take care. Bye bye.